So I'm Rick from Hypernode by Byte. Whoop. We are a hosting company out of Amsterdam, and I'm here to talk to you about MageReport. MageReport.com is a website where you can scan your Magento shop for vulnerabilities from the outside, and I'm the tech lead at Hypernode by Byte. So our core business is Magento hosting, but people generally know us from MageReport because it has become a big success for us. And I think it serves a very good purpose for the Magento community. So I'm going to tell you a bit about what MageReport is, how it came to be, what do the checks mean. I'm going to talk a bit about the current trends we see in the Magento security landscape from our perspective as the maintainers of MageReport. And I'm going to talk a bit about how we use this information from MageReport to protect our hosting platform, but also how we use our hosting platform to make the checks for MageReport to scan any shop in the world. So about MageReport.com, some history. We were a pretty traditional hosting company in 2014. We had a big data center. We hosted everything like Joomla, WordPress, whatever. And then we became the market leader for Magento hosting in the Netherlands. And at this time, Compute Cloud was at the level of hype as Kubernetes is today. So we figured we needed a silo inside the company, completely detached from the rest of all legacy things. So we would make a next generation hosting platform named Hypernode. And back then, I was there as an intern in this team together with Willem de Groot, which people mostly know. He's now the big-time Magento security researcher, and some other very smart people. So we made this new hosting platform, Hypernode. And then one day, Willem came into the office, and he was like, I have a vulnerability for Magento, and it's pretty serious. So at this time, Magento security wasn't really as big as it is today. It did exist, but people weren't really talking about it as much as now. So also around this time, vulnerability branding was just becoming a thing. So you would have the Heartbleed OpenSSL buffer overread vulnerability, where you could ask a web server for a string, and you would get more back from memory than you were actually allowed to. And somebody figured, okay, there's CVEs going out all day, every day. Everything's always vulnerable. You know this as a developer, but nobody actually pays attention. So somebody figured if you put a name on a vulnerability, people start paying attention. And a bit later, the same thing happened with the shell shock, bash, local privilege escalation vulnerability. So people really started paying attention. So Willem, who's very smart, he figured, okay, what if we put a name on this Magento vulnerability, then maybe this will become a thing, right? So he named it Shoplift, and we made a website. It was named shoplift.byte.nl, and you could go and scan your Magento site for this specific vulnerability. And for us, this became a big success because we had like thousands and thousands of scans in the first days. And then we figured we really have something here with this Magento security scanning. And from that, the MageReport project was born, and we really started developing this website. This is MageReport as we know today. We have security checks for all the Magento core vulnerabilities, and since then we've also expanded in stuff like credit card malware checks, and we have some performance checks if you do, oh, it's kind of fuzzy. Yeah, if you do host with us, we can show you some other things. But anyway, so basically how it works is we have a hosting platform hosting now exclusively Magento in the cloud, and we ship a lot of logs to our big Elasticsearch. So once we moved everything to the cloud, we had a big empty data center. We figured, let's make a very big Elasticsearch. So we had like a whole bunch of nodes gathering all this data. And then we figured out how to look at this data and interpret how hackers were looking at jobs to figure if they were vulnerable or not. And then we could use this data to make checks for MageReport. So basically what we do is whenever we know a specific endpoint in Magento is being probed at by hackers, we can install some telemetry on every request where we can, for example, log the post body of a requested disk, and then we ship this to our Elasticsearch so that we can do analysis later. So normally, for example, in Nginx and access logs, you wouldn't see the post data, but because we use a special distribution of Nginx, it's called OpenResty, we can run Lua code inside every request and then do specific stuff like this. So Lua is like a dynamic high-level language like JavaScript, except it's very, very fast. Lua JIT is one of the fastest just-in-time interpreters in the world. It's even faster than the V8 compiler in Chrome. So there's virtually no cost for each request to do something like this. But anyway, so we do have some, so this is Kibana, and in this Kibana we can basically just spot attacks happening on our network over all these Magento shops. So this was the admin vulnerability that came out last year. There was a specific version of admin that was vulnerable. Admin is like php-my-admin, except it's like a drop-in PHP file that you put on your site, and you get a nice web interface for your MySQL database. So people started probing for this specific version of admin, and then we could just see it lighting up on our Kibana, right? So we could tell how the hackers were probing for this vulnerability. And so while we do have hosting all over the world now because we're now an international company and all that. Sometimes it really stands out, these types of request patterns. So you cannot really tell because it's fuzzy, but it just says China over there. I would see that all these requests would be coming from China. So for example, if we're still hosting a lot of shops that are only selling in the Netherlands, it might not make sense to get all these requests from China on the specific endpoint. So it really stands out, and we know this might be malicious. So same thing for Russia. Ukraine is kind of a different story because we see a lot of good Magento developers coming from the Ukraine, so they do a lot of development, but there's also a lot of very good hackers in Ukraine. So we cannot just start blocking Ukraine everywhere. So we do have some type of adaptive filtering in place where we see a shop getting hit by an attack. It goes offline because it's overloaded, and then we do some detection to see if there's any known attack pattern going on, and then we just place a block inside Nginx, for example, block the entirety of China. And then the web development agency gets an email and it's like, hey, if you don't want to do this, make a more sophisticated Nginx rule yourself. But anyway, so we use all this data to figure out how to make these checks for MageReport so that we can scan from the outside for these vulnerabilities in Magento. But then since 2015, some things have changed. We mostly focused on the Magento core vulnerabilities. There was like the SUPI system for Magento 1 and then for Magento 2. But then in October last year, there were like 20 external modules inside Magento that were vulnerable to one category of attacks. So in Magento 1, there was this SUPI 8788 vulnerability, which was basically a PHP object injection inside the Magento core. That specific vulnerability was also available in like 20 different modules. So previously, our policy would be to not make any MageReport checks for third-party extensions because it's a never-ending story. If you have like a French shipping provider that has a module that's vulnerable, we don't really have the capacity to make a check for everything, right? So you have to pick something. So our policy was to not do any checks for external Magento vulnerabilities, but then this big thing happened, and we were kind of forced to because this was a remote code execution, which was very serious, so we had to make a check for this, because otherwise shops were just getting hacked left and right. So basically this exploit had 4 variants, as we could see. This is like 20 different endpoints, and one of them was like the object was base64 encoded in the get parameter, or it was plain text, or it was base64 encoded in the post body, or it was plain text. So in our web application firewall, we could handle this very nicely by just setting up some conditionals. But for scanning these, we had to make like 20 different checks for each of these endpoints. And then we started overloading the shops we were scanning because we're doing so many requests. So for us as MageReport, we had to make some kind of queuing mechanism for that. But anyway, so the community has responded to this big influx of external modules being vulnerable and now becoming a bigger vector for Magento security. So a bunch of these have already been mentioned today, but I wanted to highlight the MageVulnDB again from Willem de Groot. It's basically a blacklist for Magento modules. So external Magento modules are often vulnerable and then they get patched, but then a specific version will always be vulnerable until you upgrade, right? So it has a list of these modules and their versions, and then you can run a MageRun command line tool to scan for these vulnerabilities these versions of these modules being installed inside your shop. So I think that's a really good resource. Also, I would like to mention the security channel on MageChat, which is something we use a lot. So in this security channel, people talk about Magento security. If it isn't happening on Twitter, it's happening here. And then people just basically mention the trends they spot and stuff like that, which has been very helpful for us. Yeah, so something we've also seen lately, which is kind of new, is that some shops were targeted very specifically. So this is a tweet from Willem where he displays a shop that had a checkout form, and then this checkout form was completely replicated by hand by a hacker to look exactly like the real thing, except it was fake. So the shop was hacked, and somebody went through the trouble of actually like remaking this checkout form to look exactly like the real thing. So this could either mean one of two things. It's like maybe all these spray and pray type of attacks aren't working anymore, and the hackers have to get sophisticated, or it means the hackers are just getting very good, and now this is not a big deal anymore for them to do. Yeah, so something we've also seen is that so whenever a new vulnerability is announced, people will come up with a way to block it, for example, in the web application firewall, and then they think, okay, my server is now patched, I'm not vulnerable anymore. And then 2 weeks later, somebody figures out a different vector for the same exploit. So maybe it's like a URL with like capitalization in it, and then the the common Nginx rule that people use to block this attack doesn't work anymore, or an entirely different endpoint is used that has the same type of vulnerability, so it's still vulnerable. So we often see shops that still get hacked because they didn't patch, because they figured their hosting would take care of it. It doesn't work like that. So you still got to really patch your shop as soon as you can. So versus MageReport, over time, making these checks for Magento vulnerabilities has become a bit more complicated. We had some trouble with Magento 2, and now we're having some trouble with what do we do with all these external modules. So should we start making checks for all these external modules, or should we not? So something I would like to mention is that if we do have a false positive on MageReport, we would really like to know. So MageReport@hypernode.com is an email address for our support queue. They will look at it, and then whenever there is a false positive in our scans, it doesn't often happen, but if there is, we would really like to know, because then we can improve our checks. Okay, so for us in the future, what will happen? So we don't even have a data center anymore. We moved our Elasticsearch to the cloud. We now know kind of pretty good what we're looking for in this data. So our Elasticsearch has shrunk a bit. We are thinking about moving our Nginx replication firewall to ModSec instead of using this Lua thing, because ModSec is kind of the industry thing that people use mostly. And then when you want to start sharing your replication firewall rules, people might not understand your Lua code, but they will understand ModSec, and people will use ModSec, and then we can also use that in our systems, so that will make them a bit more easier to share. And so we had this policy of not adding any third-party vulnerability checks in MageReport. So we kind of revisited that, and I guess we still have to do that more in the future if more big, like looming things come out related to external modules. Yeah, so I went a bit too fast, but this was my presentation. Hope you guys have a lot of questions.
All right, this is a guy that wants us to get to our liquor. So does anyone in the audience have a question? No one? All right, he must have said it all. Okay, folks, let's get a hand one more time.